And knowing how to conceive metaphors, and thus to see a world immensely more various than it appears to the uneducated, is an art that is learned. For, I must tell you, in this world where today all lose their minds over many and wondrous machines, some of which, alas, you can see also in this siege, I construct Aristotelian machines that allow anyone to see with words. In the days that followed, Roberto made the acquaintance of Signor della Saletta, who represented the city fathers in their dealings with Torres. The commander was complaining. Roberto had heard about the Casalesi, in whose loyalty he had little faith. Do they not understand, Torres said, irritated, that even in times of peace Casali is in no condition to allow one simple foot soldier or a mere basket of victuals to enter without asking leave of the Spanish ministers? That the protection of the French is the city's only guarantee of being respected? But now, from Signor della Saletta, Roberto learned that Casali was not exactly comfortable with the Dukes of Mantua either. Gonzaga policy had always been to put down any Casali opposition, and for 60 years the city had suffered the progressive reduction of many privileges. You understand, Signor della Griva? Saletta said. First we complained of too many taxes, and now we are bearing the expense of maintaining the garrison. We do not love having the Spanish in our midst, but are we expected really to love the French? Are we dying for our own sake, or for theirs? And for whom did my father die? Roberto asked. Signor della Saletta was unable to answer him. Weary of political talk, Roberto went back to see Padre Emanuele a few days later, in the convent where he was staying. There, they directed Roberto not to a cell but an apartment reserved for the priest under the arches of a silent cloister. He found Padre Emanuele conversing with two gentlemen, one sumptuously dressed in purple with gold braid, a cloak with gilded trimming and lined with short fur, a doublet edged with a crocheted red stripe and a ribbon of little gems. Padre Emanuele introduced him as the ensign Don Gaspar de Salazar, but from his haughty tone and the style of his mustache and hair Roberto had already identified him as a gentleman from the enemy army. The other visitor was Signor della Saletta. For a moment Roberto suspected he had fallen into a den of spies, then he realized, as I realize on this occasion, that the etiquette of sieges allowed a representative of the besiegers access to the besieged city for meetings and negotiations, just as Signor della Saletta had free access to Spinola's camp. Padre Emanuele said that he was just preparing to show the two guests his Aristotelian machine, and he led all three into a room where the strangest imaginable piece of furniture was standing. Nor am I sure I can reconstruct its form exactly from Roberto's description of it to his lady, as it was surely something never seen before or since. The base consisted of a great chest or case whose front held 81 drawers, 9 horizontal rows by 9 vertical, each row in both directions identified by a carved letter, B C D E F G H I K. On the top of the chest, to the left stood a lectern on which a great volume was placed, a manuscript with illuminated initials. To the right of the lectern were 3 concentric cylinders of decreasing length and increasing breadth, the shortest being the most capacious, designed to contain the 2 longer ones. A crank at one side could then, through inertia, make them turn, one inside the other, at different speeds according to their weight. Each cylinder had incised at its left margin the same 9 letters that marked the drawers. One turn of the crank was enough to make the cylinders revolve independently of one another, and when they stopped, one could read triads of letters aligned at random, such as CBD, KFE, or BGH. Padre Emanuele set about explaining the concept that governed his machine. As the philosopher has taught us, genius is simply the ability to perceive objects under 10 categories, and these are substance, quantity, quality, relation, action, affection, position, time, place and state. The substances are the very subject of all reasoning and their ingenious correlatives must be predicated. What the substances are is noted in this book under the letter A, nor would my whole life suffice to make a complete list of them. In any case I have already collected several thousands, taking them from the books of poets and of wise men, and from that wondrous Regestus that is the fabric of the world of Francesco Alunno. Thus among the substances we may place, under supreme being, divine persons, ideas, gods of fable, greater, middle and lesser, celestial deities, and the aerial, marine, terrestrial and infernal, the deified heroes, angels, demons, sprites, the heavens and the wandering stars, celestial signs and constellations, the zodiac, the circles and spheres, the elements, vapors, exhalations, and then, making no attempt to mention everything, subterranean fires and sparks, meteors, seas, rivers, springs and lakes and cliffs. And so on through the artificial substances, with the works of each art, books, pens, inks, globes, compasses, squares, palaces, temples and hovels, shields, swords, drums, paintings, brushes, statues, axes and saws, and finally the metaphysical substances such as genus, species, properties and accidentals and similar notions. He pointed now to the drawers in his construction, and opening them, he showed how each contained square sheets of very thick parchment, the kind used for binding books, aligned in alphabetical order. I must tell you, each vertical row refers, from B to K, to one of the other 9 categories, and for each of them one of the 9 drawers has gathered families of members. Verbi Gratia, for quantity is recorded the family of the quantity of volume, whose members comprise the small, the great, the long or the short, or the family of numeral quantity, whose members are not 1, 2 and C, and many or few. Under quality you will find the family of the qualities associated with seeing, such as visible, invisible, beautiful, deformed, clear, obscure, or with smell, such as aroma and stink, or the qualities of affection, such as happiness and sadness, and so on for each category. And each sheet represents a member. I then consider all the things affected by it. Is that clear? All nodded with awe, and the priest continued. Now we will open at random the great book of substances, and we will pick anyone at all. Here, dwarf. What could we say, before initiating any scholarly discussion, of the dwarf? K.S. Pequeño, little, petite, ventured Don Gaspar de Salazar, y.k.s. feo, e infeliz, y ridiculo. True, Padre Emanuele granted, but still I do not know what to choose, and if I were required to speak not of a dwarf but rather, say, of corals, could I be sure of finding equally salient features so promptly? And besides, smallness has to do with quantity, ugliness with quality, and where then should I begin? No, better to trust in fortune, whose ministers my cylinders are. Now I make them move and I obtain, as random dictates, the triad BBB. B in the first position is quantity. B in the second position bids me look along the line of quantity, in the drawer of volume, and there, at the very beginning of the B sequence, I find small. And in this sheet devoted to small I find that the angel is small, as it stands on a pin, and so is the pole small, the fixed point of the sphere, and among elementary small things are the spark, the drop of water and the scruple of stone, and the atom, of which, according to Democritus, all things are composed. In human things here is the embryo, the pupil, the astragal, for animals the ant and the flea, for plants the twig, the mustard seed and the crumb, for the mathematical sciences the minimum quad. Sic, the letter I, the book bound in 16 degrees, or the apothecary's dram. For architecture the coffer or the pivot, or for fables the psychopax general of mice against the frogs and the myrmidons born of ants. But we must stop here, for I could already call our dwarf a coffer of nature, puppet of a youth, crumb of a man. And pray note that if we try turning the cylinders again and obtain instead, here we are, CBF, the letter C would refer me to quality, the B would send me to look for my members in the drawer of that which affects sight, and then the letter F would have me encounter as member the being invisible. And among the invisible things I would find, wondrous conjunction, the atom and the point, which would allow me now to define my dwarf as atom of man or point of flesh. Padre Emanuele turned his cylinders and searched through his drawers, fast as a conjurer, so the metaphors seemed to arise for him as if by enchantment, without anyone's noticing the mechanical gasping that produced them. But he was still not satisfied. Gentlemen, he continued, the ingenious metaphor has to be far more complex. Everything that I have found so far must be analyzed in its turn from the aspect of the 10 categories, and as my book explains, if we consider a thing that depends on quality, we should see if it is visible and at what distance, what deformity or beauty it has and what color. How much sound, how much odor, how much taste, if it is sensible or tactile, if it is rarefied or dense, hot or cold, and of what form, what affection, love, art, learning, health, infirmity, and if any science of it exists. And I call these questions particles. Now I know that our first essay has led us to deal with quantity, which includes smallness among its members. Now I turn the cylinders again and I obtain the triad BKD. The letter B, we have already determined, must refer to quantity. If I consult my book, it tells me that the first particle apt to express a small thing is to establish with what it is measured. If I consult the book to find to what measure refers, it sends me back to the quantity drawer, under the family of quantities in general. I go to the page for measure and there choose the thing K, which is the measure of the geometric finger. And here I would be able to compose a quite clever definition, as, for example, that wanting to measure that puppet of youths, that atom of man, a geometric finger would be an immeasurable measure, which, uniting to metaphor also hyperbole, tells me much of the misfortune and ridiculousness of the dwarf. What a marvel, Signor della Saletta said, but, in the second triad obtained, you have not yet used the last letter, the D. I expected no less of your perception, sir, Padre Emanuele said smugly, but you have touched the wonderful point of my invention. This letter is left over, and I could discard it if it bored me, or if I considered I had already achieved my aim. It allows me to resume my search. This D allows me to begin again the cycle of the particles, looking into the category of state, exempli gratia, what garb befits them, or if they can serve as emblem of something, and from there start over, as I did earlier with quantity, turning the cylinders again, using the first 2 letters and retaining the third for yet another trial, and so on ad infinitum, for millions of possible conjugations, though some may seem more clever than others, and it will be my wisdom that distinguishes those more apt to generate amazement. But I would not lie to you, gentlemen, I had not chosen dwarf at random. Only last night I applied myself with the greatest care to deriving the maximum possible advantage from this substance. He waved a page and began to read the series of definitions with which he was suffocating his poor dwarf, a little man shorter than his name. Embryo, fragment of homunculus, such that the corpuscles that arrive with the light from the window seem much greater, a body that with millions of his similars could tell the hours through the neck of an hourglass, the complexion in which the foot is close to the head, the carnal appendage that begins where it ends, the line that clots in a point, the tip of a needle, a subject to be spoken to with caution for fear that your breath would blow it away, a substance so small that it is not penetrable by color, a mustard spark, a bodkin that has nothing more or less than what it never He waved a page and began to read the series of definitions with which he was suffocating his poor dwarf, a little man shorter than his name. Embryo, fragment of homunculus, such that the corpuscles that arrive with the light from the window seem much greater, a body that with millions of his similars could tell the hours through the neck of an hourglass, the complexion in which the foot is close to the head, the carnal appendage that begins where it ends, the line that clots in a point, the tip of a needle, a subject to be spoken to with caution for fear that your breath would blow it away, a substance so small that it is not penetrable by color, a mustard spark, a bodkin that has nothing more or less than what it never had, matter without form, body without body, pure being of reason, invention of wit so minute that no blow could ever find it in order to wound it, able to escape through every fissure and feed for a year on a single barley seed, to be so epitomized that there is never any telling whether it is seated, prone, or erect, capable of drowning in a snail's shell, seed, granule, grape, dot of I, mathematical individual with arithmetical nothing. Homunculus, such that the corpuscles that arrive with the light from the window seem much greater, a body that with millions of his similars could tell the hours through the neck of an hourglass, the complexion in which the foot is close to the head, the carnal appendage that begins where it ends, the line that clots in a point, the tip of a needle, a subject to be spoken to with caution for fear that your breath would blow it away, a substance so small that it is not penetrable by color, a mustard spark, a bodkin that has nothing more or less than what it never had, matter without form, body without body, pure being of reason, invention of wit so minute that no blow could ever find it in order to wound it, able to escape through every fissure and feed for a year on a single barley seed, to be so epitomized that there is never any telling whether it is seated, prone, or erect, capable of drowning in a snail's shell, seed, granule, grape, dot of I, mathematical individual with arithmetical nothing. And he would have continued, for he possessed the material, if those present had not stopped him with applause. Chapter 10. Geography and Hydrography Reformed. Roberto understood now that Padre Emanuele behaved essentially as if he were a follower of Democritus or of Epicurus. He accumulated atoms of concepts and composed them in various guises to make many objects of them. And as the canon sustained that a world made of atoms was not in conflict with the idea of a divinity who disposed them according to reason, so Padre Emanuele from that powder of concepts accepted only the truly acute compositions. Perhaps he would have done the same if he had taken up creating scenes for the theater. Do not playwrights derive improbable and clever events from passages of probable but insipid things, so that they may be satisfied with unexpected hypertrophy of action? And if this was so, did it not perhaps happen that in the concurrence of circumstances creating both his shipwreck and the condition in which he found himself on the Daphne, the smallest detail being lifelike, the reek and creak of the hull, the smell of the plants, the cries of the birds, all collaborated in forming the impression of a presence that was nothing but the effect of a phantasmagorie perceived only by the mind, like the laughter of the fields and the tears of dew? So the phantom of a hidden intruder was a composition of atoms of action, like that of the lost brother, both formed with fragments of his own countenance and of his desires or thoughts. And as he began to hear against the panes a light rain cooling the noonday heat, he said to himself, "It is only natural, I, and no other, am the one who has climbed aboard this ship as an intruder. I disturb this silence with my footsteps, and so it is that, as if afraid of having violated another's sanctum, I constructed another self who roams beneath the same decks. What evidence have I of his existence? A few drops of water on the leaves? But is it not possible that, as it is raining now, it rained last night, however briefly? The feed? But could not the birds, pecking at what was already there, have scattered it, making me think someone had thrown new grain? The absence of eggs? Why, only yesterday I saw a gerfalcon devour a flying mouse. I am populating a hold I have not yet visited, and I am doing this perhaps for reassurance, as I am terrified at finding myself abandoned between sky and sea. Signor Roberto della Griva, he repeated to himself, you are alone and you may remain alone until the end of your days, and this end may also be near. The food on board is plentiful, but for a period of weeks, not months. Go therefore and set on the deck some vessel to collect all the rainwater you can, and learn to fish from the bulwarks, tolerating the sun. And one of these days you must find a way to reach the island, and live there as its sole inhabitant. This is what you should be thinking about, not stories of intruders and Ferrantes. Braving the light, now filtered through clouds, he collected some empty barrels and arranged them on the bridge. In performing this task, he realized he was still very weak. He went below again, lavished the animals with food, perhaps so that no one else would be tempted to do it in his stead, and once again gave up the idea of descending still farther. He came back, spent a few hours lying down, while the rain showed no sign of letting up. There were gusts of wind, and for the first time he realized that he was in a floating house, which rocked like a cradle, as a slamming of doors enlivened the considerable bulk of that wooden womb. He savored this metaphor and wondered how Padre Emanuele would have read the ship as a source of enigmatic devices. Then he thought of the island and defined it as unattainable proximity. This fine conceit showed him, for the second time that day, the dissimilar similitude between the island and the lady, and he stayed awake into the night to pen the pages I have drawn on for this chapter. The Daphne pitched all night, but its motion, like the waves of the bay, grew calm at first dawn. Through the window Roberto saw the signs of a cold but clear morning. Remembering those hyperboles of the eyes recalled the day before, he reminded himself that he could observe the shore through the spyglass he had seen in the adjoining cabin. The lens itself and the narrow field would temper the sun's glare. He set the instrument on the frame of a window in the gallery and boldly gazed at the farthest confine of the bay. The island seemed pale, its peak tufted with a patch of wool. As he had learned on the Amaryllis, ocean islands retain the humidity of the trades and condense it in cloudy puffs, so that sailors often recognize the presence of land before they can see the shores, from the clumps of the airy element that it holds as if they were anchored there. It had been Dr. Bird who told him about the so-called trade winds, in French les alices. Over those seas there are great winds that decree hurricanes and calms, but the trades joke with them, capricious winds whose movement is depicted on maps in the form of a dance of curves and currents, raving carols and graceful deviations. They penetrate the course of the greater winds and disrupt them, cut across them, race with them. They are lizards that dart along unexpected paths, as if in the sea of the contrary only the rules of art count, not those of nature. They have the form of artful things, and resemble not the harmonious arrangements of nature, such as snow or crystal, but, rather, those volutes that architects impose on domes, capitals, and columns. That this was a sea of artifice Roberto had long suspected, and it explained why down here cosmographers had always imagined creatures contrary to nature, who walked with their feet in the air. To be sure, the artists of the courts of Europe, who built grottos encrusted with lapis lazuli, fountains operated by secret pumps, had not inspired nature in her invention of the lands of those seas, any more than it was the nature of the unknown pool that inspired those artists. The fact is, Roberto said to himself, both art and nature are fond of machination, and that is simply what the atoms themselves do when they aggregate in this way or in another. Is there any more artificed wonder than the tortoise, work of a goldsmith of thousands and thousands of years past, who fashioned this Achilles' shield patiently nielloed, imprisoning a serpent with its feet? At home, he continued his musing, everything that is vegetal life has the fragility of a leaf with its veins and of the flower that lasts the space of a morning. Whereas here the vegetal is like leather, a thick and oily matter, a scaly sheath prepared to resist the rays of mad suns. Every leaf, in these lands where the wild inhabitants surely do not know the art of metals or of clays, could become instrument, blade, goblet, spatula, and the petals of the flowers are of lacquer. Everything vegetal here is strong, while everything animal is weak, to judge by the birds I have seen, spun from varicolored glass, while at home we have the strength of the horse, the stubborn sturdiness of the ox. And what of fruits? At home the complexion of the apple, ruddy with health, denotes its friendly taste, whereas the livid mushroom betrays its hidden venom. Here, on the contrary, as I saw yesterday and during the voyage of the Amaryllis, there is the witty play of opposites. The mortuary white of one fruit guarantees vivid sweetness, whereas the more russet fruits may secrete lethal filters. With the spyglass he studied the shore and glimpsed between land and sea some climbing roots that seemed to leap towards the open sky, and clumps of oblong fruits that revealed their treacly ripeness by appearing as unripe berries. And he recognized on some other palms coconuts yellow as summer melons, whereas he knew they would proclaim their maturity by turning the color of dead earth. So to live in this terrestrial beyond, he had to remember, if he was to come to terms with its nature, he should proceed in a direction opposite to his instinct, for instinct was probably a discovery of the first giants, who tried to adapt themselves to the nature of the other side of the globe. Believing the most natural nature was that to which they had become adapted, they thought nature naturally born to adapt herself to them. Hence they were sure the sun was small, as it seemed to them, whereas certain leaves of grass were immense, if they looked at them through eyes close to the ground. To live in the Antipodes, then, means reconstructing instinct, knowing how to make a marvel nature and nature a marvel, to learn how unstable the world is, which in one half follows certain laws, and in the other half the opposite of those laws. He heard again the birds waking, over there, and, unlike the first day, he realized how artful those songs sounded if compared to the chirping of his native land. Whistles, gurgles, crackles, grumblings, duckings, whimperings, muffled musket shots, whole chromatic scales of pecking. And sometimes he heard something like a croaking of frogs squatting among the leaves of the trees, in Homeric parley. The spyglass allowed him to see spindles, feathery bullets, black shutters or other shutters of indistinct hue, who flung themselves from a taller tree aiming at the ground with the insanity of an Icarus eager to hasten his own destruction. Suddenly it seemed to him even that one tree, perhaps a kumquat from China, shot one of its fruits into the air, a skein of bright crocus that quickly vanished from the round eye of the glass. He convinced himself it was the effect of a glint and gave it no further thought, or so at least he believed. We shall see later that when it came to unconscious concepts, Saint Savin was right. He thought those birds of unnatural nature were the emblem of the Parisian coteries he had left behind many months past. In this universe without humans, where, if not the only living creatures, certainly the only speaking creatures were the birds, he found himself as in that salon where, on first entering, he had caught only a vague chattering in an unknown language, whose scent he shyly perceived, though I would say he must have finally absorbed the sense of that scent, otherwise he would not have been able to reason about it as he now did. But, remembering that it was there he had met the lady, and hence if one place stood supreme above all others, it was there and not here, he concluded that they did not there imitate the birds of the island, but, rather, here on the island the animals tried to equal that most human language of birds. Thinking of the lady and of her distance, which the day before he had compared to the insuperable distance to the land westward, he looked once more at the island, of which the spyglass revealed to him only wan and circumscribed hints, yet like those images seen in convex mirrors, which, reflecting a single side of a small room, suggest a spherical cosmos, infinite and stupefying. How would the island seem to him if he were to reach it one day? To judge by the landscape he saw from his vantage point, and by the specimens which he had found on the ship, was it perhaps the Eden where milk and honey flow in streams, amid abundant trophies of fruit and flocks of meek animals? What more, in those islands of the opposing south, were the brave men seeking as they navigated there, defying the tempests of an illusory Pacific Ocean? Was this not what the Cardinal had wanted, in dispatching him on a mission to discover the secret of the Amaryllis? The possibility of taking the lilies of France to a terra incognita that would finally renew the offerings of a veil untainted by the sin of Babel or by the flood or by Adam's fall. The human beings there must be loyal, dark of skin but pure of heart, caring nothing for the mountains of gold and the bonds of which they were the heedless custodians. But if this was so, would he not be repeating the error of the first sinner if he chose to violate the virginity of the island? Perhaps Providence had rightly wanted him to be a chaste witness to a beauty that he should never disturb. Was this not the manifestation of the most perfect love, such as he professed to his lady, loving from afar, renouncing the pride of dominion? Is aspiration to conquest love? If the island were to be one with the object of his love, he owed the same nicety to it that he had shown to her. The same frenzied jealousy he had felt every time he feared another's eye threatened that sanctuary of reluctance was not to be interpreted as a claim to any right of his own. No, it was a denial of rights to anyone, a duty his love imposed on him, the guardian of that Graal. And to that same chastity he must feel bound with regard to the island. The more he wished it to be rich in promises, the less he should want to touch it. Far from the lady, far from the island, he should only speak of them, wanting them immaculate as long as they could keep themselves immaculate, touched only by the caress of the elements. If there was beauty somewhere, its purpose was to remain purposeless. Was the island he saw really like that? Who was encouraging him to decipher the hieroglyph in this way? It was known that from the time of the first voyages to these islands, situated vaguely on the maps, mutineers were abandoned there, and the islands became prisons with bars of air, in which the condemned were their own jailers, punishing one another reciprocally. Not to arrive there, not to discover the secret, was, more than a duty, a right, a reprieve from endless horrors. Or perhaps not. The only reality of the island was that in its center stood, tempting in delicate hues, the tree of oblivion, whose fruit, if Roberto ate it, could give him peace. To disremember. So he spent the day, apparently slothful but highly energetic in his effort to become tabula rasa. And, as happens to those who set themselves to forgetting, the more effort he made, the more his memory was fired. He tried to put into practice all the suggestions he had formerly heard. He imagined himself in a room crammed with objects that reminded him of something. His lady's veil, the pages where he had made her image present through his laments on her absence, the contents of the palace where he met her. And he pictured himself throwing all those things out of the window, until the room, and, with it, his mind, became bare and empty. He made immense efforts, dragging to the windowsill crockery, tapestries, cupboards, chairs, and panoplies, but, contrary to what he had been told, as he gradually wore himself out in this labor, the figure of the lady was multiplied, and from different corners she followed him in his spasms with a sly smile. Thus, passing the day in dragging furniture, he forgot nothing. Quite the opposite. These were days when he thought of his own past, his eyes staring at the one scene he had before him, that of the Daphne, and the Daphne was transformed into a theater of memory, as such theaters were conceived in his day, where every feature recalled to him an episode, remote or recent, in his story. The bowsprit, his arrival after the wreck, when he realized he would never see his beloved again. The furled sails, his long hours of staring at them and dreaming of her lost. The gallery, from which he explored the distant island and her distance. But he had dedicated to her so many meditations that, as long as he remained there, every corner of that seagoing house would remind him, moment by moment, of everything he wanted to forget. He realized this truth as he came out on deck to seek distraction in the wind. This was his forest, where he went as unhappy lovers go into forests. Here was his invented nature, plants planed by the shipwrights of Antwerp, rivers of rough canvas in the wind, tarred caverns, astrolabe stars. And as a lover, revisiting a place, recognizes the beloved in every flower, in every rustling of leaves, every path, here, now, he could die of love, caressing the mouth of a cannon. Did poets not celebrate their lady, praising her lips of ruby, her eyes of coal, her breasts of marble, her heart of diamond? Then he, too, locked in that mine of now fossil furs, would have only mineral passions. Hawsers bearing with knots would seem to him her locks, shining bosses her forgotten eyes, the sequence of eaves her teeth dripping scented saliva, a creaking capstan her neck adorned with necklaces of hemp, and he would find peace in the illusion that he had loved the work of a master of automata. Then he regretted his hardness in imagining her hardness. He told himself that in petrifying her features he was petrifying his desire, which, on the contrary, he wanted living and unsatisfied, and, as evening fell, he turned his eyes to the broad conch of the sky dotted with undecipherable constellations. Only in contemplating celestial bodies could he think the celestial thoughts proper to one who, by celestial decree, was sentenced to love the most celestial of human creatures. The queen of the forest, who in snowy dress whitens the woods and silvers the countryside, had not yet appeared above the peak of the island, covered in mourning. The rest of the sky was ablaze and visible, and, at its southwestern extremity, almost level with the sea beyond the greater land, he discerned a clot of stars that Dr. Bird had taught him to recognize. It was the Southern Cross. And, in the words of a forgotten poet, some of whose verses his Carmelite tutor had made him memorize, Roberto recalled a vision that had fascinated his childhood, that of a pilgrim in the realms of the beyond who, emerging into that same terra incognita, saw those 4 stars, never glimpsed before unless by the first, and last, inhabitants of the earthly paradise. Chapter 11. The Art of Prudence. Was he seeing them because he had truly been shipwrecked at the edge of the Garden of Eden, or was it because he had emerged from the belly of the ship as from a hellish funnel? Both perhaps. That shipwreck, restoring him to the spectacle of another nature, had rescued him from the hell of the world which he had entered, losing the illusions of boyhood in the Casali days. He was still there when, having seen history now as a place rich in whims and incomprehensible plots for reasons of state, he learned from Saint Savin how treacherous was the great machine of the world, plagued by the iniquities of chance. In a few days his adolescent dream of heroic feats was ended, and from Padre Emanuele he had learned that one should be excited by heroic enterprises, and that a life can be well spent not in fighting a giant but in giving too many names to a dwarf. Leaving the convent, he accompanied Signor della Saletta, who in turn was accompanying Signor de Salazar beyond the walls, and to reach what Salazar called Puerta de Estopa, they walked along the ramparts for a while. The 2 gentlemen were praising Padre Emanuele's machine, and Roberto ingenuously asked how all that knowledge could affect the destiny of a siege. Signor de Salazar laughed. "My young friend," he said, "we are all here, serving different monarchs, in order to resolve this war as justice and honor dictate. But the days are long gone when the sword could alter the course of the stars. The time is past when gentlemen created kings, now it is kings who create gentlemen. Now all the gentlemen you can see down there," and he pointed to the Spanish tents, "and down here," and he indicated the French camps, "are engaged in this war in order to return to their natural setting, which is the court, and at court, my friend, no one competes any longer to equal the king in merit, but only to gain his favor. Today in Madrid you see gentlemen who have never drawn their sword, and they never leave the city, for to cover themselves with dust on the field of glory they would have to abandon the city to the hands of moneyed burghers and a noblesse de robe that nowadays even a monarch holds in great esteem. The warrior may abandon valor only to follow prudence." "Prudence?" Roberto asked. Salazar suggested he look over the plain. The 2 sides were engaged in listless skirmishes, and clouds of dust could be seen rising from the mouths of the tunnels where the cannonballs fell. To the northwest the Imperials were pushing a mandale, a sturdy cart, its sides armed with scythes, while the front was an oak wall reinforced with studded bars of iron. In that wall there were slits from which mortars extended, and colubrins, and arquebuses, and from the side you could see the lanzknechts barricaded inside. Bristling with muzzles in front and with blades on the flanks, chains creaking, the machine emitted occasional puffs of smoke from one of its mouths. The enemy clearly did not intend to employ it immediately, for it was a device to be brought beneath the walls when the mines had done their work, but it was equally clear that it was being displayed now to terrify the besieged. "You see," Salazar said, "the war will be decided by machines, whether armored wagons or mine tunnels, as may be. Some of our fine companions, on both sides, who have bared their breast to the enemy, unless they died by mistake, acted as they did not to conquer but to win a reputation to be exploited on their return to court. The most valiant among them were wise enough to choose enterprises that attracted attention, but only after they had calculated the balance between what they risked and what they stood to gain." "My father," said Roberto, orphan of a hero who had calculated nothing. Salazar interrupted him. "Your father was, in fact, a man in the old style. Believe me, I mourn him. But can it still be worthwhile to perform a brave deed when people will talk more of a fine retreat than of a bold attack? Have you not observed, just now, a war machine ready to resolve the fate of a siege more swiftly than swords did in their day? And have not swords, these many years, yielded to arquebuses? We still wear a cuirass, but a pikeman could learn in a day how to pierce the cuirass of the great Bayard. Then what does a gentleman have left? Wisdom, Signor della Griva. Success no longer has the color of the sun, but grows in the light of the moon, and no one has ever said that this second luminary was displeasing to the Creator of all things. Jesus himself meditated, in the Garden of Olivet, at night. But then he came to a decision inspired by the most heroic of virtues, and without prudence. But we are not the firstborn son of the Eternal One, we are the children of our century. When this siege ends, if a machine has not taken your life, what will you do, Signor della Griva? Will you perhaps return to your lands, where no one will give you an opportunity to prove yourself worthy of your father? After a few days of association with Parisian gentlemen, you already seem won over by their ways. You will want to try your fortune in the great city, and you well know that it is there that you must make use of that halo of bravery that your long inaction among these walls will have gained you. You too will seek your fortune, and you must be keen in obtaining it. If here you have learned to dodge a musket ball, there you must learn to elude envy, jealousy, greed, using those same weapons to combat your adversaries, namely, everyone. Hear me out. For half an hour you have been interrupting me to say what you think and, under the guise of questioning me, you would show me I am mistaken. Never do this again, especially with the powerful. Occasions will arise when confidence in your own perspicacity and the impulse to tell the truth will enable you to give sound advice to someone of higher station. Never do it. Every victory produces hatred in the vanquished, and if the victory is over one's own master, then it is foolish or harmful. Princes wish to be assisted, not outstripped. But you must be prudent also with your equals. Do not humiliate them by your merits. Never speak of yourself. Either you will praise yourself, which is vanity, or you will denigrate yourself, which is stupidity. Rather, let others discover in you some venial sin, which envy can gnaw on without doing you too much harm. Be much but seem little. The ostrich never aspires to fly, and thus risk an exemplary fall. He allows the beauty of his feathers to be revealed gradually. And above all, if you have passions, never display them, however noble they may appear. Not everyone must be granted access to your heart. A prudent, cautious silence is the cabinet of wisdom. Sir, you were telling me that a gentleman's first duty is to learn simulation. Señor de la Saleta intervened with a smile. Come, my dear Roberto. Señor de Salazar is not saying the wise man must simulate. He is suggesting, if I have understood rightly, that the wise man must learn to dissimulate. It is a virtue above virtue to dissimulate virtue. Señor de Salazar is teaching you a prudent way of being virtuous, or how to be virtuous prudently. When the first man opened his eyes and discovered he was naked, he tried to conceal himself even from the sight of his maker. So diligence in hiding was born almost when the world was born. Dissimulating means drawing a veil composed of honest shadows, which does not constitute falsehood but allows truth some respite. The rose seems beautiful because at first sight it dissimulates, pretending to be so fleeting, and although it is frequently said of mortal beauty that it seems not of this earth, it is simply a corpse dissimulated by the favor of youth. In this life it is not always best to be open-hearted, and the truths that mean most to us must always be uttered by halves. Dissimulation is not fraud. It is an effort not to show things as they are. And it is a difficult effort. When we excel, others must not recognize our excellence. If someone were to become famous for his ability to disguise himself, as actors do, all would know that he is not what he pretends to be. But concerning the true, excellent dissimulators, who have existed and exist still, we have no information. And note further, added Señor de Salazar, that while you are being invited to dissimulate, you are not invited to remain dumb as a fool. On the contrary, you will learn to do with a clever word what you cannot do with open speech. To move in a world that favors appearance, and with all the rapidity of eloquence to be the weaver of words of silk. If arrows can pierce the body, words can pierce the soul. Make natural in yourself what in Padre Emanuele's machine is mechanical art. But, sir, Roberto said, Padre Emanuele's machine seems to me an image of genius, which does not aim at striking or seducing but at discovering and revealing connections between things, and therefore becoming a new instrument of truth. This is for philosophers. But for fools use genius to awe, and you will earn acceptance. Men love to be awed. If your fate and your fortune are decided not on the field but in the halls of the court, a good point scored in conversation will be more fruitful than a victorious attack in battle. The prudent man with an elegant phrase extricates himself from any complication, and can use his tongue with the lightness of a feather. Most things can be paid for with words. You are expected at the gate, Salazar, said Saleta. And so ended for Roberto that unexpected lesson in life and wisdom. He was not edified by it, but he was grateful to his two teachers. They had explained to him many of the era's mysteries, never mentioned at La Griva. Chapter 12. The Passions of the Soul. As all his illusions collapsed, Roberto fell prey to an amorous obsession. It was now the end of June, and it was quite hot. For about 10 days the first rumors had been spreading about a case of plague in the Spanish camp. Munitions were growing scarce in the city. The soldiers were being issued only 14 ounces of black bread daily, and for a pint of wine from the Castelli you had to pay 3 florins, that is to say 12 reals. Salazar from the camp and Saleta from the city had alternated visits to arrange the ransoming of officers captured by both sides in the course of combat, and the ransomed had to swear an oath not to take up arms again. There was more talk of that captain rising in the diplomatic world, Mazarini, to whom the Pope had entrusted negotiations. Some hopes, some sorties, and the game of the reciprocal destruction of tunnels. Thus the indolent siege progressed. While waiting for the negotiations or for the relief army, the bellicose spirits grew calmer. Some Castelli decided to go outside of the walls to harvest those fields of wheat spared by horses and wagons, heedless of the weary musket fire from the distant Spaniards. But not all were unarmed. Roberto saw a young peasant woman, tall and tawny, who at intervals interrupted her work with the sickle, crouched among the rows of grain, and raised a culiver, holding it like a veteran soldier, pressing the butt against her red cheek, to fire at the troublemakers. The Spaniards, irked by the shots of that warrior series, returned fire, and a ball grazed the girl's wrist. Bleeding now, she fell back, but did not cease firing or shouting at the enemy. When she was finally almost below the walls, some Spaniards apostrophized her, Puta de los Franceses. To which she replied, "Yes, I'm the Frenchman's whore, but I'm not yours." That virginal figure, that quintessence of ripe beauty and martial fury, joined to the hint of shamelessness with which the insult had crowned her, kindled the boy's senses. That day he combed the streets of Casali, eager to renew the vision. He questioned the peasants, learned that the girl's name according to some was Anna Maria Novarese, according to others Francesca, and in one tavern they told him she was 20, she came from the country, and was carrying on with a French soldier. "She's a good girl, that Francesca, a very good girl," they said with a knowing leer, and to Roberto his beloved seemed all the more desirable as she was again praised in licentious tones. A few evenings later, passing a house, he glimpsed her in a dark room on the ground floor. To enjoy the faint breeze that barely mitigated the Monferino sultriness, she was seated at the window, in the light of an unseen lamp placed near the sill. At first he failed to recognize her because her lovely hair was wound around her head, just 2 locks escaped, falling over her ears. Only her face could be seen, bent slightly, a single, pure oval beaded with a few drops of sweat. It seemed the real lamp in that penumbra. At a little low table she was occupied with some sewing, on which her intent gaze rested, so she did not notice the youth, who stepped back to peer at her from a corner, crouching against the wall. His heart pounding in his breast, Roberto noticed that her lip was shaded by blonde down. Suddenly she raised a hand even more luminous than her face, to hold a length of dark thread to her mouth. Placing it between her red lips, she bared her white teeth, severing it with one bite, the act of a gentle animal happily smiling in her domestic cruelty. Roberto could have remained there all night. He barely breathed, in his fear of being discovered and in the ardor that froze him. But after a while the girl blew out the lamp, and the vision was dissolved. He passed along that street in the days that followed, not seeing her again, save once, and even then he was not sure, because she, if it was she, sat with her head bowed, her nape bare and rosy, a cascade of hair covering her face. An older woman stood behind her, navigating through those leonine waves with a shepherdess's comb, which she sometimes laid aside to seize with her fingers a little fleeing creature, which her nails snapped with a sharp click. Roberto, no novice to the rites of delousing, discovered however its beauty for the first time, and he imagined being able to plunge his hands into those silken waves, to kiss those furrows, being himself the destroyer of those bands of infesting myrmidons. He had to move away from the enchantment because of the arrival of some noisy rabble in that street, and this was the last time the window offered him an amorous tableau. On other afternoons and other evenings he saw the older woman there, and another girl, but not his. He concluded this was not her house, but the woman's, a relative, to whom she went occasionally to perform some chore. Where she was for days, he no longer knew. An amorous yearning is a liquor that becomes stronger when decanted into a friend's ear. While he frivolously scoured Casali and became thin in his search, Roberto was unable to hide his condition from Saint Savin. He revealed it out of vanity, for every lover bedecks himself with the beauty of his beloved, and of this beauty Roberto was certain. Love her, then, Saint Savin responded negligently. It is nothing new. It seems humans derive pleasure from it, unlike animals. Animals do not love? No, simple machines do not love. The wheels of a wagon, what is it they do along a slope? They roll towards the bottom. The machine is a weight, and the weight hangs, dependent on the blind need that impels it downwards. So it is with an animal. It is weighted towards intercourse and is not appeased until it has had it. But did you not tell me yesterday that men are machines? True, but the human machine is more complex than the mineral and the animal, and it enjoys an oscillatory motion. So you love, and therefore you desire and do not desire. Love makes us the enemy of ourselves. You fear that attaining your end will disappoint you. You have pleasure in lamine, as the theologians put it, you enjoy delay. That's not so. I want her at once. If that were the case, you would be still only a rustic. But you have wit. If you wanted her, you would already have taken her, and you would be a beast. No, you want your desire to be set aflame, and you want hers to be stirred as well. If her desire were to blaze to such a degree that she was impelled to surrender herself to you at once, probably you would no longer want her. Love flourishes in expectation. Expectation strolls through the spacious fields of time towards opportunity. But what am I to do in the meantime? Court her. But she knows nothing yet, and I must confess I have difficulty approaching her. Write her a letter and tell her of your love. But I have never written a love letter. Indeed, I am ashamed to say, I have never written any letter. When nature fails, we turn to art. I will dictate to you. A gentleman often enjoys writing letters to a lady he has never seen, and I am equal to the task. As I do not love, I can speak of love better than you, who are struck dumb by love. But I believe each person loves in a different way. It would be artificial. If you revealed your love to her in tones of sincerity, you would seem awkward. But I would tell her the truth. The truth is a young maiden as modest as she is beautiful, and therefore she is always seen cloaked. But I want to tell her of my love, not of the love you would describe. Well, if you would be believed, feign. There is no perfection without the splendor of machination. But she would understand that the letter is not speaking of her. Never fear. She will believe that what I dictate to you is made to her measure. Come now, sit down and write. Just allow me to summon my inspiration. Saint Savin moved about the room as if, Roberto tells us, he were imitating the flight of a bee returning to the honeycomb. He was almost dancing, his eyes restless. He seemed to read in the air the message that did not yet exist. Then he began. My lady. Lady? Well, how would you address her? Perhaps. Hola, little hussy of Casali? Puta de los Franceses. Roberto couldn't help murmuring, alarmed as Saint Savin had in jest come so close, if not to the truth, at least to the insult. What did you say? Nothing. Very well. Lady. Then what? My lady, in the wondrous architecture of the universe, it has been written since the natal day of creation that I would encounter you and love you. But with the first line of this letter, I feel that my soul has already so poured forth that it will abandon my lips and my pen before this is concluded. Concluded. But I don't know if that will be comprehensible to a. The truth is all the more appreciated when it is barbed with difficulties, and a revelation is more respected if it has cost us dearly. Let us raise the tone, in fact. Let us say then, my lady. Again? Yes, lady. For a woman beautiful as Alcidiana, an unassailable dwelling is without doubt necessary, as it was for that heroine. And I believe that by enchantment you have been transported elsewhere and that your province has become a second floating island that the wind of my sighs causes to retreat as I attempt to advance, the province of the Antipodes, a land where ice floes bar my approach. You look puzzled, Legrive. Does it still seem commonplace to you? No, the fact is. I would say quite the contrary. Have no fear, Saint Savin said, misunderstanding, there will be no lack of the counterpoint of contradictions. Let us proceed. Perhaps your charms entitle you to remain distant as is proper for the gods. But do you not know that the gods receive with favor at least the fumes of incense we burn to them here below? Do not then refuse my worship. As you possess beauty and splendor to the highest degree, you would make me impious if you prevented me from adoring in your person two of the greatest divine attributes. Does that sound better? At this point Roberto was thinking that the problem now was whether or not Lenovarese could read. Once this barrier was overcome, what she read would surely intoxicate her, as he was becoming intoxicated, writing. My God, he said, she should go mad. She will. Continue. Far from having lost my heart when I entrusted my freedom to your hands, I find it has grown larger since that day, multiplied, as if, since one heart alone is not enough for my love of you, it were reproducing itself in all my arteries, where I feel it throbbing. Good Lord. Keep calm. You are speaking of love, you are not loving. Forgive, my lady, the raving of a desperate man, or, better, pay no heed to it. Sovereigns have never been held to account for the death of their slaves. Ah yes, I should consider my fate enviable if you take the trouble to cause my destruction. If you will deign at least to hate me, this will tell me I am not indifferent to you. Thus death, with which you think to punish me, will be for me a cause of joy. Yes, death. If love means understanding that two souls were created to be united, when one realizes that the other does not feel this union, he can only die. And this, while my body still lives, though not for long, is the message that my soul, departing from it, sends you. Departing from it? Sends you. Let me catch my breath. My head is spinning. Control yourself. Do not confuse love with art. But I love her. You understand? I love her. And I do not. For this reason you have come to me. Write without thinking of her. Think of, let me see, Monsieur de Torres. Monsieur, do not look like that. He is a handsome man, after all. But write, lady. Again? Again. Lady, I am fated moreover to die blind. Have you not made of my eyes two alembics, wherein my life must evaporate? And so it happens that the more my eyes are moistened, the more I burn. Perhaps my father did not mold my body from the same clay that gave life to the first man, but, rather, from lime, since the water I shed consumes me. And how does it happen that I still live, though consumed, finding yet more tears to be consumed further? Are you not exaggerating? On grand occasions thought must also be grand. Now Roberto protested no longer. He felt as if he had become Lenovarese and was feeling what she should feel on reading these pages. Saint Savin continued dictating. Abandoning my heart, you have left in it an insolent creature who is your image and who boasts of having the power of life and death over me. And you have gone from me as sovereigns leave the torture chamber for fear of being importuned with pleas for mercy. If my soul and my love are composed of two pure sighs, when I die I will beseech my agony that the breath of my love be the last to leave me, and I will have achieved, as my last gift, a miracle of which you should be proud, and for one instant at least you will draw a sigh from a body already dead. Dead. Is that the end? No, let me think. We need a closing with a point. A what? Yes, an act of the intellect that expresses the inconceivable correspondence between two objects, beyond all belief, so that in this pleasant play of wit any concern for substance is happily lost. I do not understand. You will. Here. Let us reverse for the moment the direction of the appeal. In fact, you are not yet dead. Let us give her the possibility of hastening to succor this moribund lover. Right. You could perhaps, my lady, yet save me. I have given you my heart. But how can I live without the very motor of life? I do not ask you to give it back to me, for only in your prison does it enjoy the most sublime of freedoms, but I beg you to send me, in exchange, your own, that could find no tabernacle more prepared to welcome it. To live you have no need of two hearts, and mine beats so hard for you that it can assure you of the most eternal of fervors. Then, half turning and bowing like an actor anticipating applause, he asked, beautiful, is it not? Beautiful? Why, I find it, how can I say, ridiculous. Do you see this lady running around Casali delivering hearts, like a sort of page? Would you expect her to love a man who speaks like any ordinary citizen? Sign it and seal it. But I am not thinking of the lady. I am thinking that if she were to show it to anyone, I would die of shame. She will never do that. She will keep the letter in her bosom, and every night she will light a candle beside her bed to read it, and cover it with kisses. Sign and seal. But let us imagine, for the sake of argument, that she cannot read. She will have to find someone to read it to her. Monsieur de Lagrive, are you telling me you have been captivated by a peasant? That you have squandered my inspiration to embarrass a rustic? You must give me satisfaction. It was just a hypothesis. A jest. But I was taught that the prudent man must consider situations, circumstances, and along with the possible also the impossible. You see, you are learning to express yourself properly. But you have considered badly and chosen the most risible among possibilities. In any case, I would not wish to force you. Strike out the last sentence and continue now as I say. But if I strike it out, then I will have to rewrite the letter. So you are lazy, into the bargain. But the wise man must exploit misfortune also. Strike it out. Done? Now then. Saint Savin dipped one finger into a pitcher, then he allowed a drop to fall on the cancelled line, making a little damp spot, its edges irregular, growing gradually darker as the water caused the black ink, diluting it, to flow back on the sheet. Now write. Forgive me, my lady, if I lack the heart to allow the survival of a thought that, stealing from me a tear, has frightened me with its boldness. Thus may an Etnaean fire generate the loveliest stream of brackish water. But ah, my lady, my heart is like a seashell that, imbibing the beautiful sweat of dawn, generates the pearl and grows to be one with it. At the thought that your indifference would take from my heart the pearl it has so jealously fed, my heart flows from my eyes. Yes, Lagrive, this is unquestionably better, we have restrained the excesses. Better to end by reducing the vehemence of the lover, to increase the emotion of the beloved. Sign, seal, and send. Then wait. Wait for what? The north of the compass of prudence consists in unfurling the sails to the wind of the favorable moment. In these affairs waiting never does any harm. Presence takes the edge off hunger, and distance sharpens it. Maintaining your distance, you will be considered a lion, while being present, you could become a mouse born of the mountain. You are certainly rich in fine qualities, but qualities lose their luster if touched too often, whereas fancy travels farther than sight. Roberto thanked him and rushed home, concealing the letter in his bosom as if he had stolen it. He feared someone might rob him of the fruit of his theft. I will find her, he told himself, I will bow and hand her the letter. Then he tossed in his bed, thinking how she would read it with her lips. By now he was imagining an Anna Maria Francesca Novarese endowed with all those virtues Saint Savin had attributed to her. Declaring, even if in another's voice, his love, he had felt more than ever a lover. Doing something uncongenial, he had been enticed by genius. He now loved La Novarese with the exquisite violence he described in his letter. A few days later, setting out to find the one from whom he had been so prepared to remain distant, heedless of the danger as cannon fire rained down on the city, he saw her at a street corner, laden with sheaves like a mythological figure. With great inner tumult he ran to her, not knowing quite what he would do or say. Having approached her, trembling, he stood before her and said, "Young lady." "Me?" The girl answered, laughing, and said, "Well?" Well, Roberto could think of nothing better to say. "Could you tell me which direction I should take for the castle?" And the girl, throwing back her head and the great mass of her hair, said, "Oh, that way, of course." And she turned the corner. At that corner, as Roberto was uncertain whether or not to follow her, a whistling cannonball fell, knocking down a garden wall and raising a cloud of dust. He coughed, waited till the dust settled, and realized that by ambling too hesitantly through the spacious fields of time he had missed the favorable moment. To punish himself, he scrupulously tore up the letter and turned towards home, while the shreds of his heart lay crumpled on the ground. His first, imprecise, love convinced him forever that the beloved object must dwell in the distance, and I believe this conviction sealed his fate as a lover. During the next days he went back to every corner, where he had received information, where he had found a trail, where he had heard her mentioned, where he had seen her, to reconstruct a landscape of memory. He thus laid out a Causali of his own passion, transforming alleys, fountains, squares into the river of inclination, the lake of indifference, or the sea of hostility. He made the wounded city into the land of his personal unsated tenderness, an island, presage even then, of his solitude. Chapter 13. The Map of Tendernes. On the night of June 29th a great noise wakened the besieged, followed by a rolling of drums. The enemy had managed to explode the first mine beneath the walls, blowing up a lunette and burying 25 soldiers. The next day, towards 6 in the evening, something like a storm was heard to the west, and in the east a cornucopia appeared, wider than the rest of the sky, with a tip that extended and retracted. It was a comet, which upset the soldiers and led the local inhabitants to lock themselves in their houses. Over the next weeks other parts of the wall were blown up, while from the ramparts the defenders fired back in vain, for now the enemy moved underground, and the countermines were unable to dislodge him. Roberto lived in this wreck like an alien passenger. He spent long hours discussing with Padre Emanuele the best way to describe the fires of the siege, and he saw more and more of Saint Savin to develop with him similarly appropriate metaphors to depict the fires of his love, whose failure he had not dared confess. Saint Savin provided him with a stage whereon his amorous story would be happily enacted. In silence he submitted to the ignominy of drafting, with his friend, further letters, which he then pretended to deliver, rereading them every night instead, as if the diary of all those longings were addressed to him from her. He envisaged situations in which Lenovarese, pursued by Landsknechts, fell overcome into his arms as he routed the assailants and led her, exhausted, into a garden where he enjoyed her wild gratitude. On his bed he abandoned himself to such thoughts, recovered his senses after long swoons, and composed sonnets for his beloved. He showed one to Saint Savin, who remarked, "I consider it of an extreme repugnance, if I may say so, but console yourself. In Paris the majority of those who are called poets produce worse. Do not poetize about your love, passion deprives you of that divine coldness that was the glory of Catullus." Roberto found himself of melancholic humor, and said as much to Saint Savin. "Rejoice," his friend remarked. "Melancholy is not the lees but the flower of the blood, and it generates heroes because, on the border of madness, it spurs them to the bravest of actions." But Roberto did not feel spurred to anything, and he became melancholy because he was not melancholic enough. Deaf to cries and cannon fire, he heard rumors of relief. The Spanish camp is in turmoil, they say the French army is advancing. And he rejoiced because in mid-July a countermine had finally succeeded in slaughtering many Spaniards. But meanwhile many lunettes were being evacuated, and in mid-July the enemy vanguard could already fire directly into the city. He learned that some Cassalici were afraid to fish in the Po, and, not worrying that he might be taking streets exposed to enemy fire, he ran to look, afraid the Imperials might shoot at Lenovarese. He forced his way among the soldiers, who were discontent because their contract said nothing about the digging of trenches, but the Cassalici refused to do it for them, so Torres had to promise his men extra pay. Like all the others, Roberto was delighted to learn that Spinola had fallen ill of the plague, and pleased to see a group of Neapolitan deserters enter the city, abandoning in fear the hostile camp threatened by the disease, though he heard Padre Emanuele say that the arrivals could themselves become a source of contagion. In mid-September, when the plague appeared in the city, Roberto still paid no attention, except to fear that Lenovarese might fall ill. Then he woke one morning with a high fever. He managed to send someone to inform Padre Emanuele, and was secretly borne to his convent, avoiding one of those makeshift lazarettos where the sick died without fuss so as not to distract the others engaged in dying of pyrotechnics. Roberto did not think of death. He mistook his fever for love and dreamed of touching the flesh of Lenovarese, while he rumpled the folds of his pallet or fondled the sweating, aching parts of his body. In the grip of an exuberant memory, that evening on the Daphne, as night advanced, as the sky performed its slow motions, and the Southern Cross disappeared on the horizon, Roberto no longer knew whether he was burning with revived love for the warrior Diana of Casali or for the lady equally far from his sight. Yearning to know where she could have fled, he rushed into the cabinet of nautical instruments, where he seemed to recall there was a map of those seas. He found it. Large, colored, and incomplete, as many maps then were incomplete out of necessity. The navigator, coming upon a new land, drew the shores he could see but left the rest unfinished, never knowing how and how much and whither that land extended. Hence the maps of the Pacific often seemed arabesques of beaches, hints of perimeters, hypotheses of volumes, and only the few circumnavigated islands were defined there, like the course of the winds learned from experience. Some cartographers, to make an island recognizable, simply drew with great precision the form of the peaks and the clouds hanging over them, to render them identifiable, as you might recognize a man by his hat brim or his halting gait. Now, on this map, the outlines of the two facing shores were visible, divided by a channel running from south to north. One of the two shores, with irregular curves, practically defined an island, and it could be his island, but beyond a broad stretch of sea there were other groups of presumed islands of very similar formation, which could equally represent the place where he was. We would err if we thought that Roberto was gripped by a geographer's curiosity. Padre Emanuele had trained him only too well to reverse the visible through the lens of his Aristotelian telescope, and Saint Savin had taught him too well to foment desire through language, which can turn a maiden into a swan or a swan into a maiden, the sun into a ladle or a ladle into the sun. Late in the night we find Roberto daydreaming over the map now transformed into the desired female body. If it is a lover's error to write on the sands of the shore the beloved name, which is only to be washed away then by the waves, how prudent a lover Roberto felt himself, having entrusted his beloved's body to the arcs of grottos and gulfs, her hair to the flow of the currents through mazy archipelagos, the summer moisture of her face to the glint of the waters, the mystery of her eyes to the blue of a vast desert, and the map repeated many times the features of that beloved body, in various attitudes of bays and promontories. Desirous, he was wrecked with his mouth on the map, he sucked in that ocean of voluptuousness, tickled a cape, hesitated to penetrate a strait, his cheek pressed against the page, he breathed the breath of the winds, he would have liked to savor the pools and the springs, fling himself thirsting to drink the streams dry, become sun to kiss the banks, tide to caress the secret estuaries. However, he was to enjoy not possession but, rather, privation. While, raving, he touched that vague prize of an erudite pen, others perhaps, on the real island, where it reclined in charming poses the map had not yet been able to capture, were biting into its fruits, bathing in its waters. Others, stupefied and ferocious giants, extended at that moment a rough hand to its breast. Misshapen Vulcans possessed that delicate Venus, grazed her mouths with the same ignorance of the fishermen of the island not found who, beyond the last horizon of the Canaries, foolishly discards the rarest among pearls. She in another's loving hands. This thought was the supreme intoxication in which Roberto writhed, howling his rapier impotence. And in this frenzy, as he groped on the table as if to seize at least the hem of a skirt, his gaze slipped away from the depiction of that softly waved Pacific body to another map, where the unknown author had sought perhaps to portray the fiery conduits of the volcanoes of the western land. It was a portrait of our entire globe, all plumes of smoke at the summits of projections of the crust or inside a tangle of dried veins. And he felt suddenly the living image of that globe. He moaned, exuding lava from every pore, the lymph of his unsatisfied satisfaction erupting, as he lost also his senses, destroyed by arid hydropsy. So he writes, over that longed for austral flesh. Chapter 14. A treatise on the science of arms. At Kausali, too, he dreamed of open spaces, and of the broad valley where he had seen La Novarese for the first time. But now that he was no longer ill, he concluded, more lucidly, that he would never find her again, either because he would soon be dead, or because she was dead already. Actually, he was not dying. Indeed, he was gradually recovering, but he did not realize this and mistook the languors of convalescence for the languishing of life. Saint Savin came often to visit him, supplying him with a gazette of events if Padre Emanuele was present. The priest kept an eye on the visitor, as if he were about to steal Roberto's soul. But when the older man had to leave, for in the convent negotiations were intensifying, Saint Savin philosophized on life and death. My friend, Spinola is dying. You are already invited to the great festivities we will hold for his decease. My friend, next week I shall also be dead. That is not true. I would recognize the face of a dying man. But it would not be right for me to distract you from the thought of death. Indeed, take advantage of your sickness to perform that admirable exercise. Monsieur de Saint Savin, you talk like an ecclesiastic. Not at all. I am not urging you to prepare for the next life, but to use well this, the only life that is given you, in order to face, when it does come, the only death you will ever experience. It is necessary to meditate early, and often, on the art of dying, to succeed later in doing it properly just once. Roberto wanted to get up, but Padre Emanuele forbade it, not believing that Roberto was yet ready to return to the confusion of the war. Roberto hinted that he was impatient to find a certain person again. Padre Emanuele considered it foolish that his body, so wasted, should allow itself to be further weakened by the thought of another body, and he tried to make the female species seem contemptible to him. That most vain womanly world, he said, that certain modern female Alices carry on their back, revolves around dishonor and has the signs of the crab and Capricorn for its tropics. The mirror, which is its primum mobile, is never so murky as when it reflects the stars of those lewd eyes, transformed, through the exhalation of the vapors of stultified lovers, into meteors heralding disaster for honesty. Roberto did not appreciate the astronomical allegory, nor did he recognize his beloved in the portrait of those society sorceresses. He remained in bed, though still exhaling the vapors of his infatuation. More news reached him meanwhile from Signor della Saletta. The Cassalici were wondering if they should not grant the French access to the citadel. They had realized by now that if the enemy was to be denied entry, citizenry and garrison had to join forces. But Signor della Saletta implied that now more than ever, while the city seemed on the point of falling, its inhabitants made only a show of collaborating, while in their hearts they laughed at the pact of alliance. It is necessary, he said, to be innocent as the dove with Monsieur de Torres, but also sly as the serpent in the event that his king wishes them to sell Kausali. We must fight in such a way that if Kausali is saved, we can share in the merit, but without going too far, so that if it falls, the blame will be attributed entirely to the French. And he added, for Roberto's instruction, the prudent man must never harness himself to a single wagon. But the French say that you are merchants. No one notices when you fight, and all see when you are selling at high prices. To live much it is best to be worth little. The cracked pot is never entirely broken, and in the end its very endurance becomes wearing. One morning, at the beginning of September, a liberating downpour struck Kausali. The healthy and the convalescent all went outside to enjoy the rain, which would wash away every trace of contagion. But it was more a refreshment than a cure, and the disease continued to rage even after the storm. The only consoling news was the equally destructive job the plague was doing in the enemy camp. Able now to stand on his feet, Roberto ventured out of the convent, and at a certain point, at the threshold of a house marked with a green cross designating it as a place of infection, he saw Anna Maria or Francesca Novarese. She was wan as a figure in the dance of death. Once snow and garnet, she was reduced to a sallow uniformity, though her haggard features had not lost their former charms. Roberto recalled the words of Saint Savin. Would you continue your genuflections after old age has turned that body into a phantom, able only to remind you of the imminence of death? The girl was weeping on the shoulder of the Capuchin, as if she had lost someone dear, perhaps her Frenchman. The Capuchin, his face grayer than his beard, was supporting her, one bony finger pointed at the sky, as if to say, one day, up there. Love becomes a matter for the mind only when the body desires and that desire is suppressed. If the body is weak and unable to desire, the mental aspect vanishes. Roberto discovered he was so weak that he was incapable of loving. Exit Anna Maria, Francesca, Novarese. He went back to the convent and to bed, determined to die really. He suffered too much at not suffering more. Padre Emanuele recommended he take fresh air, but the news arriving from outside did not encourage him to live. Now, besides the plague, there was famine, or rather, something worse. A frenzied hunt for the food that the Cassalici were still hiding and did not want to give to their allies. Roberto said that if he could not die of the plague, he wanted to die of starvation. Finally Padre Emanuele got the better of him and sent him out. Turning the corner, Roberto came upon a group of Spanish officers. He started to flee, but they saluted him ceremoniously. He realized that as various bastions had been breached, the enemy was now installed in various parts of the town, whence it could be said that it was not the country besieging Casali, but Casali that was besieging its own castle. At the end of the street he encountered Saint Savin. "My dear Legrive," he said, "you fell ill a Frenchman and you were healed a Spaniard. This part of the city is now in enemy hands. And we may pass? Do you not know that a truce has been signed? And, in any case, the Spanish want the castle, not us. In the French sector wine is growing scarce, and the Cassalici bring it up from their cellars as if it were the most precious blood. You will not be able to keep good Frenchmen from frequenting certain taverns in this quarter, where the tavern keepers are now bringing in excellent wine from the country. And the Spaniards receive us like great gentlemen. Except that the proprieties must be respected. If you want to brawl, you must brawl in your own quarter and with compatriots, for in this area we must behave politely, as is correct between enemies. So I confess the Spanish quarter is less amusing than the French, for us at least. But do join us. This evening we want to serenade a lady who had concealed her charms from us until the other day, when I saw her look out of a window for an instant." And so that evening Roberto found again 5 familiar faces from the court of Torres. Even the abbé was of the company, and for the occasion had decked himself out in laces and furbelows with a satin sash. "The Lord forgive us," he said with flaunted hypocrisy, "but the spirit must yet be appeased if we are still to perform our duty." The house was in a square in what was now the Spanish part of the city, but the Spanish at that hour must all have been in the pothouses. In the rectangle of sky outlined by the low roofs and the crowns of the trees flanking the square, the moon reigned serene, only slightly pocked, and was reflected in the water of a fountain murmuring in the center of that wrapped quadrangle. "O fairest Diana," Saint Savin said, "how calm and peaceful must your cities and your villages be, that do not know war, for the Selenites live in their own natural felicity, ignorant of sin." "No blasphemy, Monsieur de Saint Savin," the abbé said. "For even if the moon were inhabited, as Monsieur de Moulinet has fancied in that recent romance of his, and as the scriptures do not teach us, those inhabitants would be most unhappy, as they would not know the incarnation. And it would have been most cruel of the Lord God to deprive them of that knowledge," Saint Savin rebutted. "Do not seek to penetrate divine mysteries. God had not vouchsafed the preaching of his Son even to the natives of the Americas, but in his goodness he now sends missionaries there, to carry the light to them. Then why does Monsieur the Pope not send missionaries also to the moon? Are the Selenites perhaps not children of God? Do not talk foolishness. I will ignore your having called me a fool, Monsieur l'Abbé, but you must know that beneath this foolishness lies a mystery, which certainly our Lord Pope does not wish to reveal. If the missionaries were to discover inhabitants on the moon, and saw them looking at other worlds within the range of their eyes but not of ours, they would see them wondering if on those other worlds there are not other creatures living, similar to us. And the Selenites would then ask themselves if the fixed stars also are not so many suns surrounded by their moons and by their other planets, and if the inhabitants of those planets also see other stars unknown to us, which would be that many more suns with as many planets, and so on, to infinity. God has made us incapable of conceiving the infinite, so be content, human races, with the quia. The serenade, the others were whispering. That is the window. The window was bathed in a rosy light that came from the interior of an imagined chamber. But the two debaters were by now aroused. And further, Saint Savin insisted, mocking, if the world were finished and surrounded by the void, God would also be finished. Since his task, as you say, is to dwell in heaven and on earth and in every place, he could not dwell where there is nothing. The void is a non-place. Or else, to enlarge the world he would have to enlarge himself, and be born for the first time where before he was not, and this would contradict his proclaimed eternity. Enough, sir. You are denying the eternity of the Eternal One, and this I cannot allow. The moment has come for me to kill you, so that your so-called wit can no longer weary us. And he drew his sword. If that is your wish, Saint Savin said, saluting and putting himself on guard. But I will not kill you. I do not wish to subtract soldiers from my king. I will simply disfigure you, so that you will live wearing a mask, as the Italian comedians do, a fitting distinction for you. I will draw a scar from your eye to your lip, and I will give you this neat pig castrator's cut, but only after having taught you, between a feint and a parry, a lesson in natural philosophy. The abbé attacked, trying to strike home at once with great slashes, shouting at his opponent that he was a poisonous insect, a flea, a louse to be crushed mercilessly. Saint Savin parried, then pressed him, driving him back against a tree, but philosophizing at every move. Aha! What wild slashes and thrusts, the vulgar chops of one blinded by rage. You lack any idea of fencing. But you also lack charity, in your contempt for fleas and lice. You are too small an animal to be able to imagine the world as a big animal can, as the divine Plato displays it to us. Try to imagine the stars as worlds with other lesser animals, and remember that lesser animals in turn serve as worlds to still lesser breeds. Then you will not find it contradictory to think that we, and also horses and elephants. Our whole world's for the fleas and the lice that inhabit us. They do not perceive us because of our bigness, as we do not perceive larger worlds because of our smallness. Perhaps there is now a population of lice that takes your body for a world, and when one of them has traveled there from forehead to nape, his fellows say of him that he has dared venture to the confines of the known earth. This little populace considers your hair the forests of their country, and when I have struck you, they will see your wounds as lakes and seas. When you use your comb, they believe this agitation is the flux and reflux of the ocean, and it is their misfortune to inhabit such a changeable world, because of your inclination to comb your hair constantly like a female, and now that I snip off that tassel, they will take your cry of anger for a hurricane. There, and he snipped off an ornament, almost ripping the abbé's embroidered jacket. The abbé foamed with rage. He had moved to the center of the square, looking behind him to make sure there was room for the movements he was now essaying, then retreating so that the fountain would protect his back. Saint Savin seemed to dance around him, without attacking. Raise your head, Monsieur l'Abbé. Look at the moon, and reflect that if your God was able to make the soul immortal, he could easily have made the world infinite. But if the world is infinite, it will be so in time as well as in space, and therefore it will be eternal, and when there is an eternal world, which has no need of creation, then it will be unnecessary to conceive the idea of God. Oh, what a fine joke, Monsieur l'Abbé. If God is infinite, you cannot curtail his power. He could never abopere cesser, and therefore the world will be infinite. But if the world is infinite, then there will no longer be God, just as there will soon be no more tassels on your jacket. And suiting the deed to the word, he snipped off a few more appendages of which the abbé was so proud, then he shortened his guard, lifting the tip slightly, and as the abbé tried to close the distance, Saint Savin sharply struck the flat of his opponent's blade. The abbé almost dropped his sword, clutching with his left hand his aching wrist. He cried, "I must finally cut you open, you villain, you blasphemer. Holy womb, by all the damned saints of paradise, by the blood of the crucified." The lady's window was opened, someone looked out and shouted. By now all present had forgotten the purpose of their enterprise and were moving around the two duellers, who shouted as they skirted the fountain, while Saint Savin confounded his enemy with a series of circular parries and feints on the tip of his weapon. "Do not call on the mysteries of the Incarnation for help, Monsieur l'Abbé," he quipped. "Your Holy Roman Church has taught you that this ball of mud of ours is the center of the universe, which turns around it, acting as its minstrel and strumming the music of the spheres. Be careful, you are allowing yourself to be driven too close to the fountain, you are getting your hem wet, like an old man suffering from stones. But what if, in the great void, infinite worlds are moving, as a great philosopher said before your similars burned him in Rome, and very many of them are inhabited by creatures like us, and what if all had been created by your God, where does the redemption then fit? What will God do with you, sinner?" the abbé cried, parrying a cut with some effort. Was Christ perhaps made flesh only once? Was original sin committed only once, and on this globe? What injustice! Both for the other worlds, deprived of the Incarnation, and for us, because in that case the people of all the other worlds would be perfect, like our progenitors before the fall, and they would enjoy a natural happiness without the weight of the cross. Or else infinite Adams have infinitely committed the first error, tempted by infinite Eves with infinite apples, and Christ has been obliged to become incarnate, preach, and suffer Calvary infinite times, and perhaps he is still doing so, and if the worlds are infinite, his task will be infinite, too. Infinite his task, then infinite the forms of his suffering. If beyond the galaxy there were a land where men have 6 arms, as in our own terra incognita, the Son of God would be nailed not to a cross but to a wooden construction shaped like a star, which seems to me worthy of an author of comedies. Enough, I will put an end to your comedy, the abbé screamed, beside himself, and he flung himself at Saint Savin, wielding his final blows. Saint Savin parried them effectively, then there was a static instant. While the abbé had his sword raised after a prime parry, Saint Savin moved towards him as if to attack, and pretended to fall forward. The abbé stepped to one side, hoping to strike him as he fell. But Saint Savin, who had not lost control of his legs, sprang up like lightning, supporting himself with his left hand on the ground as the right darted upwards. It was the coup de la muette. The tip of the sword marked the abbé's face from the base of the nose to the upper lip, slicing off the left half of his mustache. The abbé was cursing as no Epicurean would ever have dared to, while Saint Savin stood erect and saluted, and the witnesses applauded his master stroke. But at that very moment, from the end of the square, a Spanish patrol arrived, attracted perhaps by the noise. Instinctively, the French put their hands to their swords, the Spanish saw 6 armed enemies and cried betrayal. A soldier aimed his musket and fired. Saint Savin fell, struck in the chest. The officer saw that 4 men, rather than engage in fighting, rushed to the fallen man, throwing aside their weapons. He looked at the abbé, covered with blood, realized that he had interrupted a duel, gave a command to his patrol, and all of them disappeared. Roberto bent over his poor friend. "Did you see?" Saint Savin murmured with an effort. "Did you see, Legrive, my muette? Ponder it and practice it. I would not have the secret die with me. Saint Savin, my friend." Roberto was weeping. "You must not die in such a foolish way." "Foolish? I defeated a fool and I am dying on the field, and by enemy led. In my life I have observed a wise mean. To speak always seriously provokes irritation. To be always witty, contempt. To philosophize always, sadness. To jest always, uneasiness. I have played every role, according to the time and the occasion, and once in a while I have also been court jester. But this evening, if you tell the story well, it will not have been a comedy but, rather, a fine tragedy. And do not grieve at my dying, Roberto. He called him by name for the first time. Une heure après la mort, notre âme évanouie, sera si qu'elle estoire une heure avant la vie. Lovely verses, are they not? He died. Deciding on a noble lie, to which the abbé consented. All said that Saint Savin died in a clash with some lanzknechts who were approaching the castle. Torres and all the officers mourned him as a hero. The abbé told how in the clash he, too, had been wounded, and he prepared to receive an ecclesiastical benefice on his return to Paris. In a brief period of time Roberto lost father, beloved, health, friend, and probably the war. He could find no consolation in Padre Emanuele, who was too taken up with his counsels. Roberto returned to the service of Monsieur de Torres, last familiar image, and bearing his orders, he witnessed the final events. On September 13, envoys of the King of France, the Duke of Savoy, and Captain Mazarini arrived at the castle. The relief army was also negotiating with the Spanish. Not the least bizarre note in that siege. The French sought a truce in order to arrive in time to save the city. The Spanish granted it because their camp, devastated by the plague, was also in a critical state, desertions were increasing, and Spinola was by now clinging to life with his teeth. Torres found himself forced to accept the terms of the agreement imposed by the newcomers, which allowed him to continue defending Casale after Casale was already taken. The French would establish themselves in the citadel, abandoning the city and the castle itself to the Spanish, at least until the 15th of October. If by that date the relief army had not arrived, the French would abandon the citadel, too, truly defeated. Otherwise the Spanish would relinquish both city and castle. Meanwhile, the besiegers had to provide the besieged with victuals. This is surely not the way we might feel a siege should have gone in those days, but such was the agreement. This was not waging war, it was playing dice, interrupting the game when the opponent had to go and urinate. Or perhaps it was like betting on a winning horse. And the horse was that approaching army, whose dimensions increased gradually on the wings of hope, though no one had seen it. Living in Casale, in the citadel, was like living on the Daphne, imagining a distant island, and with intruders in the house. The Spanish vanguards had behaved well, but now the main body of the army was entering the city, and the Casalesi had to deal with bullies who requisitioned everything, raped the women, clubbed the men, and treated themselves to the pleasures of city life after months in the woods and fields. Equally distributed among conquerors, conquered, and those shut up in the citadel, the plague. On September 25 there was a rumor that Spinola had died. Rejoicing in the citadel and bewilderment among the conquerors,